Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the QX lecture series. I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities, in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I am extremely excited to discuss the impact of Ukraine's informal economy on women, mobilizing transnational communities for growth and opportunity during crisis, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Milana Nikolko is an adjunct professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Carleton University and a Sessional instructor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Some of you might know that Milana is currently teaching a politics, government, and society course for the center as well. From 2005 to 2014, Milana was an associate professor of political science at Vernadsky National University in Ukraine, and also in 2008, she was appointed as a visiting professor at political science department at the Valdosta State University in the United States. She's published extensively on topics of Ukraine's nation-building process, mediation of gray zone conflicts, political narratives of victimization among ethnic minorities, migrants and diaspora groups from the post-Soviet countries. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Milana Nikolko.
Thank you, Yuliia. Thank you for this beautiful introduction. It is my great pleasure to build up a stronger connection with the University of Manitoba by leading the course on modern Ukrainian society and politics with Manitoba students. But also it was my long desire to introduce my own research, which we combined actually, and we conducted together with different institutions at Carleton, and the research still continue. Research on the important characteristic of engagement, two different parts of Ukrainian communities. One is living abroad and one remains back at home, back in Ukraine. I would like to start to share my slides. Please bear with me for a second. All right, thanks. So again, thank you so much, Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. I'm sharing with you some prospects which were already resulted in publication of impact of Ukrainian informal economy on women, and we apply the lens of Canadian diaspora mobilization from 2014 till 2019. Right now, this project continues in a little bit different framework. Now we're researching on countries affected by conflict, or fragile countries. Ukraine was affected by conflict 2014-19, but we still see the outcomes of this significant economic problem. And again, today we're going to focus mostly on economic and social perspective of the crisis 2014-2015. In nowadays, our regional research on Ukrainian Canadian engagement and mobilization during the crisis were supported by International Organization for Migration. Then we changed affiliation with Carleton University, and now we enjoy research project on Canadian stage, also located at Carleton, but now we incorporate in different countries such as Sri Lanka, Haiti, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and there are still a list of other countries we would like to engage in this broader framework, which I would like to introduce you with my next slide. Please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me. I provide you my email address, and I'm pretty sure Yuliia will be a great communicator in this as well. I would like to start with a very emotional connection to every Ukrainian Canadian. Roman Vashuk, former ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, and he was serving in this very important role during the critical time, from 2014 till 2019. Recently, in his presentation to Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, he expressed his concerns, let's say, in soft way, try to frame it nicely, about specific of donor helps to a particular during Ukrainian crisis. He framed it as what the West get wrong. We examine Western support for reforms in Ukraine. He pointed 10 positions which lead to some ineffective engagement of international community and donors, and in very broad and at some point partially official support of Ukrainian communities and Ukrainian societies during the time of him being as ambassador in Ukraine. And in fourth position, I would like to mention precisely, he focused on some part of Ukrainian population who will be in center of our research today. I just emphasize part of his speech, and again, this is just transliteration of his oral presentation, so please do not quote. It's just for us to understand the specific of the situation. At the same time, we seem to have forgotten about the majority of Ukrainian population. By saying we, he's talking about international community and donors. Those who lived in the rural areas, small towns, or regional centers, which have been suffering from economic issues, have felt forgotten in 2014-2019. They were amongst those who agreed to go to the war, but they felt that Kyiv and the foreign partners didn't care about them. So today, when we're going to talk about the specific and map the Ukrainian informal economy, we will be mostly talking about rural part of Ukraine. Although urban centers have also large part of informal economy as well, in rural part we see domination of the informal economy, particularly in the part of Ukraine which were affected by Ukrainian conflict 2014, eastern part of Ukraine. Let me move to the next slide. So when we started our research, and again, the group of researchers include 3 different approaches. We have one theorist of migration, Dr. David Carleton from Carleton University. We have one economist, Sam McIsaac, also Dr. Sam McIsaac, NIPSE, Carleton University, and myself. I represent migration studies and Ukrainian studies. We tried to puzzle and emphasize the specific situation which occurred in Ukraine in 2014-15 precisely, when we can see significant decrease of general income of population, economic shock, internal and external migration, and I'm trying to avoid, let's say, put aside the war going on in the part of the country. So we try to focus our attention on the economic situation and situation in the formal economy from the gender perspective. So doing the primary research, we find there is significant literature gap concerning the role of the informal sector and gender dynamics in supporting subsistence activities of post or during the crisis. We also find that paid informal sector is roughly evenly split among male and female labor in Ukraine. But if we consider to focus on the formal sector and include an informal sector, other models of labor activities such as labor migration, in-house work, care about elderly and children, this proportion of informal engagement become significantly larger if one accounts to unpaid household work, mostly performed by women. Our research question was how diaspora connections can influence gender dynamics and how, in turn, to do this dynamic, reshape diaspora remittances strategies, investments, and household consumption in Ukraine. So in fact, we're going to talk about a few different actors who will occupy the stage of this research. We're going to analyze diaspora activities, and again, diaspora activity is going to be portrayed as organized activities, as activities in the host country, in our case, Canada. Individual remittances, economic and financial connection back to Ukraine, performed by labor migrants or new migrants. In terms of Canada, that's very obvious connection. We're also going to analyze specific of the policy initiatives initiated by host country, Canada in our case, and effective response from the country of origin in Ukraine. So let's move to the theoretical framing. For the particular research, we engaged at least two major terms. One is diaspora positionality in terms of the host state representation. And second term I would like to introduce, it's unwritten ground rules. I would like to explain them a bit in greater detail. So when we're talking about Maria Koinova's framing for diaspora positionality, she's mostly focusing on how diaspora organizations or umbrella diaspora organization position at the host country. We know there is a tradition of migrants-dependent states, such as the United States and Canada, when they have very elaborate institution of incorporated new migrants and providing the comfort, ethnic, and let's say linguistic and religious environment for this ethnic group through the helping and advertising and even supporting different type of diaspora initiatives. Different model of positionality could be found in the countries such as United States, where we have representation of diaspora, official management facilities and institutions on the federal level. In United States, there are also some federal organizations contributed to diaspora activities. In Canada, we don't have this enlarged institution of diaspora representation covering all different ethnic communities in Canada, but on provincial level, in everyday communication, diaspora community in Canada feel very established, and they engaged in multiple type of communication. They have wide model of resources, including economic collaboration, diaspora force wide-ranging and comprehensive, including political engagement. It could be lobby, it could be a different type of activism, which as a freedom of expression of particular ethnic groups, and economic representation, which could reflect through the remittances, investments, or breaking circulation. Social, and we all learn about social engagement of diaspora through the volunteer work, which again was climaxing during 2014-2015. Promotion of human rights, different type of activism could be framed in this particular model of positionality. Next, I would like to move to the cultural positionality, which might include media production, creation of subculture, development, and let's say sustain of the ethnic unities of the particular diaspora group. In some fact, even if in some manners, even legal diaspora positionality, which can be presented through the transnational and transitional justice and work of memories. And to understand better the differences in diaspora positionality, we can, for example, take Ukrainian diaspora in Turkey, which is very new and diverse and some very dynamic diaspora, but it's smaller, significantly smaller compared to Canadian Ukrainian diaspora, just 40,000 people. Generally, gender specific, because it's mostly represented by female activists on all levels, including regular members and heads of the diaspora organization, but they're very new. They are not engaged in the political culture of Turkey. Plus, political climate in Turkey absolutely different. You would not see this thriving mode of multiculturalism, which allowed diaspora representatives feel free and enjoy the uniqueness of their ethnic characteristics and culture. So diaspora positionality varies from country to country. Ukrainian Canadians enjoy high status in Canada and definitely very much engaged in the political structure and political fabric of everyday life in Canada. Another important component for research is unwritten ground rules, and that's, we brought this term from the financial research and the research in economics, and we try to attribute this knowledge of unwritten ground rules as one of the central beneficial model which could diasporas apply to them both home country and host country. So unwritten ground rules, it's a business term which includes the knowledge of different models of communication existing in the host country in Canada. So Ukrainian Canadians very much engaged and knows the political, economic, and financial system in the country, how to attribute their knowledge and how to manifest their, which kind of mechanism could be used to manifest particular resources and include different strategies to communicate diaspora's desire to their political authorities in the host country, but at the same time, diaspora still maintain the knowledge of political culture of home country. Again, coming back to Ivaniuk criticism of international donors I mentioned in the very beginning of this presentation, he pointed out that each international donors try to come with their links, with their view of how reforms in Ukraine should be provided. And it shows the very little knowledge of specific political culture and political traditions in Ukraine. Diaspora occupied a very sweet and a very important spot in this communication strategies between international donors, host countries such as Canada, and home countries by known unwritten ground rules in both countries. So that's a very important knowledge which could be transferable and which could be of great help when we can see engagement of multiple actors in model of addressing aid in home country in Ukraine. Another important characteristic of diaspora, information managers, interlocutors, brokers. When diaspora generates political, not just in less economic, but mostly political, social, cultural, rent from the aid, trade, and financing. So by being serving as a bridge, as a communicator between home and host country, diaspora still maintain very large position and actually accumulate more symbolic capital, playing effectively in helping to provide and meet different needs of home and host country. Diaspora networks produce important substitution effect, filling gaps in activities where the home and host states do not have the capacity or interest to act. So when we approach this situation in Ukraine 2014-15, we try to combine different methodological perspectives to triangulate, that means find the best possible and most adequate method plus, I would say, shot of situation in Ukraine. So when we try to combine different methods, we brought the quality method. So we arranged some focus groups in 2015 and again in 2016 among Ukrainian Canadians. Second, we also rely very much on the statistics mostly provided by World Bank and National Bank of Ukraine. We work with different think tanks in terms of organizing our knowledge on the level of remittances and different type of support, which could be, which could help us to analyze impact of diaspora on informal economy, particular gender aspects back home. And third position in our analysis, we try to understand the major trends in this development between countries of middle income, that's where Ukraine position right now, but at the same time to see how the remittances and financial help affected country development during the crisis and post-crisis, applying different stories from all over the world. So we incorporated multiple comparison links in our analysis and engaged already existing narratives on this effect which remittances pay towards them countries which suffering economically. And again, it was our links in this analysis during the crisis. So why we pick Canada? Because it's very unique diaspora organization. We're talking about, of course, we were analyzing different engagement, and we apply strategies in our analysis, particularly in focus group, when we were talking to people from different diaspora generations. We also were tracing activities of UCC as an umbrella organization for Ukrainian Canadian activists. Particular, UCC was incredibly active in 2014-15, working and engaging in multiple level of communication in Canada, raising the donor support, actively pressing on Canadian government, lobbying the initiative, supporting Ukrainian independence, and working actively on the ground back in Ukraine. So we have 2 rounds of focus group. We conducted 2 rounds of focus group in September 2015 and another one 2019. It was 5 focus group in total. We try to balance representation, so we have 17 women and 19 men, and we also divide response of our participants on the 3 main categories. We were able to reach some labor workers, labor migrants, which come to Canada on a temporary visa for a short period of time and obtain their position about what's going on in Ukraine and how they can help and how they see themselves in Canada and back in Ukraine. But we mostly were working with the new migrants who come to Canada permanent base and reside in Canada between 1 to 10 years. So the recent migrant wave. So when we start to addressing the issue, we were trying to understand limitations and strength of Canada diaspora support in improving gender dynamics in situation of state fragility or conflict affected state. So again, a state fragility did not apply to Ukrainian characteristic, but conflict affected states definitely was our case. Canadian government has frequently cited correlation between gender empowerment and state stability using, for example, UNDP Gender Empowerment Index. Getting more women involved in economy and political process, its target can only be built social cohesive through the enhanced inclusiveness. So when we going to analyze the specific of Ukrainian situation in 2014-15 and the policy initiative which was generated by Canadian authorities with engagement of Ukrainian Canadian diaspora, we will have in mind this general attitude that this balance of informal economy, which in Ukraine is progressing from formal to informal, and it's fluid, but we can still see very large presence of informal economy. Prevent women particularly to enjoy transparent and safe in engagement in the labor forces. So let's move to the specific situations in Ukraine which occurred in 2014. I'm pretty sure some obvious facts now may be skipped, but I just want to emphasize that worldview and media was mostly focused on situation on the battlefield in 2014 and 15. But at the same time, Ukraine went through the significant economic crisis in 2015 precisely, and it reached its peak on February 2015, around the Minsk II agreement was signed. We'll have to state that GDP plummeted from 143 billion in 2010 to 121 billion in 2015. We see also significant employment dropped, and we see that incredibly high inflation rate, which in some cases was reaching 50%. Then Ukrainian hryvnia was stabilized by the end when actually Minsk agreement was signed, and now we can see about 30% impact of the military crisis and war with Russia, which appeared in this time on Ukrainian hryvnia. So, despite those Ukrainian Canadians diaspora were mobilized very much in support of Ukrainian society, I would like to start with a specific of the response which appeared in Ukraine to ongoing situation. So in 2014, a crisis during that time, particularly in 15, we can see increase of outward migrants flow, mainly from the affected eastern region. That constitutes a reversal of the pre-2014 trend that Western regions supply next to all migrant outflows. Asylum seekers seen passage into the EU went from fewer than 1,000 to almost 15,000 in 2014 and over 20,000 in 2015. Foreign direct investment outflow increased with a net of foreign direct investment going from negative 7.2 to negative 0.3 billion. So we can see significant decrease in foreign direct investments to Ukraine. And this decrease was partially compensated in increase of remittances. So the burden of the destabilized economy was partially surpassed, and I would say with the help of foreign workers and labor workers, Ukrainian labor workers, mostly living in the closest area in neighboring countries such as Poland, Czech Republic, Russia. Russia still contributed very much in terms of the remittances and continue to contribute till nowadays. But the impact of remittances become now more important in terms of stabilization of the personal income. Just show you. Another, in terms of the effect of the external migration, at least 1.2 million people left Ukraine in 2015-16 and moved to the neighboring countries. Some of them seeking migration in Israel, another immigration destination become and always been United States and Canada. Around 1 million people migrated to Russia from affected territories, from the territories affected by the war. Again, we have this data from the Russian sources, so it's not clear how we proceed with them because it's still, there is no consensus about exactly how many people reside in Russia from affected by the war territories, but approximately exodus of 2014-15 was about 1 million people moved to Russia. When we're talking about internal dynamics, when we look at the informal economy and specific of internally displaced person settlement in 2014-15, I want you to look at the map right in the center of this presentation. It is UN Refugee Agency map, and you'll see that about half of the IDPs in Ukraine settled close to the area of occupied Donbass and Luhansk, and they also contributed, the people who relocated and contributed to the increase in poverty in the region by actually suppressing and putting more pressure on social net in this region. Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast in Ukraine, all two of them together, we can see the numbers reach almost 800,000 of IDPs reside in this particular territories. If you look at the gender specifics of IDPs, majority of IDPs are women, and we can see that establishing of new internal migrant strategies highly affected these rural areas of Donetsk and Luhansk and deepen even poverty in this particular territory. I'd like to introduce some brief history of Ukrainian informal sector before 2014-16, but with particular attention will be paid to that at the time. After Ukrainian independence in 1991, female-to-male employment ratio decreased from almost 82% in 1999 to 75% in 2017. In the 1990s, official employment in Ukraine declined by about 1/3. In 2005, 3/4 of Ukrainians found their primary income insufficient to buy daily necessities, which pushed majority of them to look and consolidate informal incomes and to incorporate informal sources in their everyday economic activities. Estimate the size and impact of Ukrainian informal economy vary significantly, but most reports suggested that it plays a crucial role, especially given the decline of the agriculture and industrial sectors in some eastern part of Ukraine. In the last year alone, Ukrainian formal economy has been declined significantly. It's also corresponded to the general global decline of economy, but very effective and very transparent this decline in Ukraine. About 30% to 31% of Ukrainian economy remains in this gray zone. Although women constitute about 42% of those employed in the informal sector, according to the State Statistics Service of Ukraine, a broad interpretation of formal economy that includes foreign activities of labor migrants, remittances flow, household work, and other labor roles, including traditionally unpaid or self-employed work, is expected to be predominantly women. The more engaged in informal economy in the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise without right and benefits which compensate and which comes with a legal occupation. Within the private sector, widespread employer discrimination against women in the recruitment process limits women's access to jobs, including many high-pay and prestigious jobs. Employers in both public and private sectors regularly specify gender when advertise vacancies and use informal resources, particularly through the interview regarding family circumstances, to deny women employment. Women are also pushed away from entrepreneurship due to less access to capital and gender social norms that suppress labor regulation that exist in the formal sector. While gender inequality affects all different areas of informal employment, informal self-employment is one is particular concern in this particular in the situation of country affected by the conflict. When we're talking about gender perspective of Ukrainian migration, we also see different variation of gender-specific migration. For example, Portugal or Spain in Italy is the most iconic case, show us predominantly female migration. About 80% of Ukrainians who move to these countries as a labor force immigrate there permanently or temporary. 80% of them are women. The similar trend could be found in Turkey. If we're talking about migration to Russia, for a long period of time, it was predominated by men. About 80% of labor migrants to Russia, based on Russian statistics and Ukrainian border control, men. Canada enjoy much balanced migration strategies. In recent findings, which announced by Natalia Hanenko-Friesen, they're conducting very interesting research on recent migrants to Canada. They see the trends that female migration become a new trend in Canada from Ukraine. I'm curious to know what particular stories behind these statistics, because looks like we have a new trend as a university, or let's say educational migration, the continued kind of bride migration and model of family reunification migration. But based on our interviews, a majority of the let's say pushing forces in migration to Canada, they're predominantly male, and they're considered as a breadwinner and someone who bring the family to Canada and continue to be financial locomotive. When we return back to Ukrainian specifics of informal sector, traditionally large part of Ukrainian economy remains opaque, means gray, means informal, between 30 to 40% of GDP. This impact of 30% increase in employment in 2014 and 16 as a direct effect of ongoing war with Russia and loss of the territory of Crimea, and plus increasing migration wave of male migrants to European Union states as a result, again, of ongoing conflict in Ukraine in 2014-15, we can see that crisis affected countries' gender balance. According to the World Economic Forum, Ukraine was ranked 79th out of 144 countries in the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report, having dropped from 48th place a decade earlier. This drop could be explained in this significant problem in economic performance and growth of an informal economy. Plus, again, when we try to calculate the female engagement in informal economy, there's two different strategies. One includes care and housework, remittances and labor practices, foreign labor practice. Second, mostly focusing on informal economy, commercial activities. When we bring another perspective of understanding gender-related issues in the formal and formal sector in Ukraine, it's important to understand that in Ukraine, we see significant difference in strategic representation of the women, particularly in the top manager position in all sectors of economy. So they definitely have and at the same time, we saw among individual entrepreneurs, it also dominated by men. And in terms of legal entities, the women consist of from about 30 to 40% of managers in the field, depends on the area of your interest. Slide. Over the last 25 years, women have played a less active role in formal economy, as a result received less economic benefits. One of the main indicators of the shift is difference in payroll between men and women. Between 2000 and 2016, the paid labor wage gap fluctuated between 31% in 2003 and 22% in 2010. And it grows significantly since 2014. Besides horizontal and vertical stratification of the Ukrainian market labor is increasingly evident. Women work in low-paid sectors of economy hold lower position on average. For instance, after 1991, the ratio of women employed in well-paid industries dropped to 22% against 28% for men, and increased in low-wage sectors to 65% compared to 54% of men. Vertical segregation is equally pervasive. Traditional female-dominant sectors, such as the public sector, boost high employment rates, 76% of women, yet 81% of civil servants holding the first category position, such as top managers, are men. This disproportional engagement of women in reproductive labor keeps many of them from entering productive economic activity. Among economically inactive women, approximately 29 are housewives, where the same figure for inactive men is closer to 10%. In 2016, the most significant difference between economically active men and women was the age category, 25 to 34 years, about 20% point. The first two, these categories represent imbalanced distribution of reproductive labor among Ukrainian families, where the gender stereotypes of typical man and woman behavior seriously affected social and economic roles. Data on household labor shows that Ukrainian women spend considerable amount of time on household work in all of the Europe, and it's approximately 25 hours per week without regard to childcare. The Ukrainian government had played an active role in monetization of reproductive labor. At least it was like that for a long period of time. And in some way created this culture of a social network, social net among the women of reproductive age. Indeed, this model was a core feature of the Soviet era established under socialism, where regular child support payments were not just a form of financial support for families with children, but also a way to sustain women's income for a period of 3 years following childbirth. By 2000, reproductive financial support was set around 70% of the minimum wage for the first child and progressing accordingly with every other child. The payments for third and fourth child were equal to the comparable to the full salary. This mechanism of compensation reproduction later was particularly crucial in the rural areas of Ukraine, where unemployment is traditionally higher. This model of reproductive support encouraging women to stay out of the formal labor market while strengthening their position in the family. Nonetheless, by 2014-15, social payments such as this drop as much as 43 to 69%, depends on amount of kids you have in your household. By 2016, monthly payments for the firstborn were only 17% of minimum wage. In the same year, 85% of families with 3 children and 87% of families with 4 children were trapped in poverty. We see the significant trends in deepening poverty, particularly in the territories of rural part of Ukraine, close to the conflict zone. We also were able to trace the rise of the very scary tendencies in the economy, so-called bioeconomy. Bioeconomy is a rise and engagement of your body as asset in economic interaction. We saw the rise of bioeconomy in Ukraine in the 90s, when Ukraine was experiencing significant human traffic, gender-related human traffic out of the country. about 260,000 were engaged and were victimized during this time. Another interesting and scary phenomenon observed by many academics and scholars in 2015 when bioeconomy reproduced a little bit differently in the areas of rural part of Ukraine, also center of the Ukraine in the Kiev, as engagement Ukraine in international commercial surrogacy. I don't know how much you're interested in this phenomenon, but Ukraine become a new center for international commercial surrogacy, and we will, and again, this characteristic of gender-specific bioeconomy show us the engagement of last resources, female body, reproductive specifics into the commercialization in most of the cases, in order to survive the consequences and the effect of the crisis. Let's move to the specific of diaspora engagement in the world in this particular time. So when we mentioned that during the crisis, we saw that diaspora mobilized their resources all over the world, and we saw the rise of remittances in 2015, and the rise continue. These data presented by our International Organization for Migration, it shows us sustainability of the transactions between labor migrants out of the country and their families back at home. If the first slide shows us the model how money were transition or sent from one country to another, the second slide shows in greater details how this money being spent. And again, this data applied to the situation 2015-2016 and the major sources are International Organization for Migration. So based on the region of the remittances, for example, let's take Canada as our example. Majority of the remittances coming from Canada to Ukraine was spent on consumption, daily needs, food, utilities. Some of them went on savings, significantly less in investments. Again, when we were conducting our group discussions on these particular issues, majority of the people were agreeing about the money being spent on everyday needs and everyday consumption. Some of them consider investments in savings, such as investments in the property back home. So these numbers might vary. It depends on, again, on interpretation of investments. I am in this particular case focus in investments just in it's a bank's terms of business stocks and bonds. In our interviews, we saw many people consider investments as a purchase of some flat or some houses back in Ukraine, and it's broad a little bit, this category. Nevertheless, when we're talking about the remittances flowed in 2014-15, Canada continued the trend which was established after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the first migrants came to Canada, the first wave of first immigrants came to Canada. We saw not that significant remittance flow because a majority of new migrants to Canada consider their destiny here. There's a very little percentage of temporary labor migrants in Canada. We don't see this overwhelming remittances flow back to Ukraine. The remittances percentage of remittances flow much higher from the countries which Ukraine border with, such as Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Russia again. Specific of gender roles and remittances behavior, again, we're talking about two perspectives. One, who is remitting, and second, who is spending. So again, there's a specific pattern. So the men largely favor investments, while women favor consumption. Women engage more in in-kind remittances, which includes some voluntary engagement, charity, different part of the gifts, and different model of in-kind support. In general, women remit less than men because, again, there is a significant delay in incorporating of the woman in in case of Canada as well. It's also shown that women remit less from Canada to Ukraine because they postpone the engagement in the labor market in Ukraine because quite often come as a reproductive age and remain in this reproductive model of organization of their family for a bit longer time. But we also can see that there is a different model of, let's say, different roles in terms of formal and informal remittance behavior. So informal remittancing, including gifts, gift certificates, in-kind help, was quite often applied to the female labor migrants and female representative of diaspora. When we were discussing the specific of migration to Canada and relating continued connection with Ukraine, we were focusing on major characteristics. On women, we were trying to understand the female strategies in terms of migration to Canada and how they maintain their connection back home. Specific of Canada show us that the movement delay their remittances in terms of the time, how often they remit, how regularly they remit, and how much they remit, and when they start to remit. And in the same time, we also see that significant difference between all established diaspora and seasonal and guest workers. They are remitting more often, they're remitting much more because they have much stronger connection to the country back home. We also find that during the crisis, diaspora support and migration in gender specific and in general, remittance become a counter cycle that quite often during the stable time, remittances corresponded to income of the labor migrant, but during the crisis time, there is no clear correspondence. It's demand what actually pushing people to remit more, demand in the home country. So counter-cycle remittances was compensated lack of foreign direct investments in the country, and at some point help Ukraine to overcome the very dire situation in 2015. Although women tend to have lower earning on average, they remitting and in some cases similar proportion to the male counterparts. Women also known to remit more frequently, but in general maybe lower sum. In 2014, 2/3 of Ukrainian migrants abroad remit funds back to Ukraine, and this proportion was a little bit different again to Canadian context. Specific of remittances in Canada show us the Canadian Ukrainians do not consider remittance as a major help to the country. And let's move to this next characteristic of Canadian and Ukrainian in Canada. So proportionally, Canadian diaspora, it's not as large as diaspora in Poland, Russia, and the United States. It's large, but it's not as effective in terms of remittance. Second, based on preceding analysis, we know that far from inducing the structural changes, those large remittances are contributing to increasing social inequality to the extent they enable to sufficiently move women out of the informal sector. Third, remittances are not substitutes for foreign direct investments. In short term, and their situation as a crisis, they help individual households to overcome problems in home country, but it cannot be substitute for foreign direct investments, particularly if we consider how the remittances used in home country consumption model, where women are more likely to find, so the women are more likely to stay in this situation and perform as a person who stayed home taking care of kids and looking less for their formal employment. Finally, diaspora strategy need to focus on addressing underlying structural weaknesses of Ukraine conflict-affected areas, such as poor governance and corruption-free economy. Let's move to the other important actor when we're talking about positionality of Ukrainian Canadians. We're talking about Ukrainian Canadian diaspora and the engagement in the tough and continued correspondence with Canadian authorities. So relation between Ukrainian diaspora and Canada in conditioned by both homeland institutions and structures, as well by host state integration regime. The integration is reflected in institutional arrangements such as political representation structures, association, and multicultural policies. Canada is institutionally open and supporting Ukrainian sovereignty through the multiple formally mandated state-driven channels. We will discuss 8. There is a free trade agreement between Ukraine and Canada trade, and ongoing military assistance, which helps to rebuild Ukrainian military forces. It's a continuous project and it's very effective on the ground of Ukraine. Plus, there are transnational channels that include remittances, representation, international organization, and large investments flow. The brief summary of what we learned so far about situation in Ukraine in terms of gender-specific informal economy, consumptions versus investment strategies, and different positionalities of the diaspora all over the world, we can say that Canadian positionality is very strong, and a Canadian reaction in 2014-15 to Ukrainian situation and economy, and particular war with Russia, was very strong on multiple levels. We saw significant diaspora engagement. We saw response from the Canadian authorities and monitoring of the situation, and freeing the sum to support Ukrainian democracy development, safety, security. In the same time, we saw that informal economy and human involvement, in particular in 2014-15, deepened and brought even more female representation in this underpaid and really untransparent model of relation, which part of Ukrainian economy still persists. Consumption and investment, these two major characteristics applied to the remittances strategies. And we found that during the crisis, of course, majority of remittances went through for consumption and less for investments. Right now, we saw there's some stabilization. People more and more saving money in terms of organizing their strategies of sustainable development in the country back in the sustainable development of their family. An important finding as well that if during the crisis remittances help to overcome the burden of the immediate threat, insecurity of poverty, it cannot be considered as a long-lasting strategy for the communication between home and host country. In 2000, information I would like to briefly introduce this initiative Canadian initiative, and then hopefully we'll move to questions. In 2017, Canadian government launched the first explicit commitment to feminist foreign policy agenda through the Feminist International Assistance Policy Framework. At the time when Liberals took over from the incumbent Conservative government, Justin Trudeau was quick to declare that Canada is back as an active middle power reminiscent to the person's era of Canadian politics. The IAP's primary objective is publicly stated as a contribution for global effort to eradicate poverty worldwide by addressing inequality and focusing on the empowerment of women and girls. The policy also suggests an approach based on human rights with backhand as intersectionality by addressing numerous other forms of discrimination. The shift towards such a framework supports the Liberal government international approach in supporting an array of different international development goals, most notably Sustainable Development Goals. The government has employed numerous tools in the application of FIAP. One such a tool is gender-based analysis plus, tool that is now mandated to be integrated in the federal policies and proposals, both domestic and foreign. In 2019 federal budget, the government committed to increase the assessment of equity factors in policymaking processes. FIAP has given rise to important debates about the benefits and limitations of such an approach. Although the official formalization and institutionalization of a more gendered approach should be seen as significant improvement in expanding the analytical lens of policymakers, it has suffered from the numerous oversights, such as frequent conflation of gender and women, as well as limited incorporation concepts of intersectionality, compounding inequalities. Eventually, intersectionality is only a kind of buzzword. It's not clearly and consistently conceptualized for further analysis in foreign policy. Within the context of this research, although the focus is more narrowly on women than gender broadly, this intersectionality is critical in understanding how the socioeconomic hardship and violence, a more vulnerable migrant status, and various other facets of potential discrimination not included in this particular analysis, but should be researched further. So I mentioned the FIA and different actions of area, such as inclusive governance. We saw increase of initiatives and from Ukrainian NGO and Ukrainian authorities in order to address the issue. On your left, you see that a specific, very interesting appearance of Canadian Ambassador Larissa Galadza, which hosted the Women, Peace and Security event, International Peacekeeping Security Center in Ukraine, and addressing particular issue of human insecurity, informal economy, and gender related violence in the rural part of Ukraine, particularly Luhansk and Donetsk. We also saw different new platforms, as a UR Reform platform has now specific initiative dedicated to gender inequality and gender equality initiatives. United Nations Development Program also very much supply and rearrange different international aid to help Ukraine to adequately answer the demand for gender equality. There's very few specific initiatives towards the rural gender inequality and informal engagement in Ukraine, but it's definitely work in progress. So we can see that we have this mismatching quite often in terms of addressing the issue with a woman-related poverty and gender. We also can see some continuous disconnects between civil society and in Ukraine, understanding of intersectionality and those of Canada's diplomatic and international development officials. And in terms of general conclusion for my presentation, I want to emphasize that we saw significant increase of gender-related poverty. New model of bioeconomy appeared, growth of informal female employment and informal self-employment, which is particularly concerned because carries some many risks for the women involved in this kind of activities. We saw the multiple and corresponded response from Ukrainian Canadians and Ukrainian authorities, although it's not always work in unison, but at the same time we saw that the activities supplies and support each other, and we see that Ukrainian Canadians may play a very important role as on both on the personal level and person connection level and institution level as a bridge organization which enjoy a strong positionality in host country in Canada, but at the same time maintain the knowledge of this undeclared ground rules in Ukraine to supply efficient advice, economic support, guidance in terms of cultural and social engagement to overcome the problem which appeared in 2014-15 and still affect Ukrainian society and Ukrainian politics. Thank you so much. I think that's it for my presentation. Sorry for being long.
Thank you so much, Milana, for your detailed presentation, also for sharing your insight on this multidimensional issue. Now I'd like to open the floor for questions, so feel free to submit your questions into the chat box, or you can also indicate to us if you'd like to ask a question yourself. So while you're getting your thoughts together, I was pondering with the following thought. You have mentioned that a lot of women choose not to participate in the formal labor market, and remittances are not always helpful in this regard. So is gender disparity when it comes to the formal participation in labor activities driven mostly by the culture, by some of the institutional frameworks, perhaps self-selection or other factors? What is your take on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Yuliia. All the factors you mentioned incredibly important. I mentioned this existing culture of care for the kids when this a bit a longer model of continual care or kids care at home considered by many as a major primary role. So gender stereotypes are very much in place in Ukraine till today. Second, by entering the competition in the formal market in Ukraine, the women feel disadvantaged very often. It shows in the analysis, for example, Olena Strelnikova, when she conducted interview among young professionals. Up to the recent days, actually, situation has been changing slightly. And again, in urban centers, you can see much more perspectives for the young ambition female workers compared, for example, to the rural perspectives. So in Strelnikova's finding, she say even in equal model, which seems equal model in terms of competition by entering the labor market, women quite often self-censor themselves by not applying for the high position, starting in the lower position, consider first, for example, they first refuse, for example, if she experience or has a negative experience on the labor market, they self-censor themselves from and kind of prevent themselves and find the other niche to maintain their representation and fall into this unfortunately trap of gender stereotypes. Okay, I better prefer to stay with family. So the situation is changing. Even few years, I believe maybe 5 years ago, in Kiev National University, I think they have now gender specific department. I don't know what it's called. Is a department or is it just center, but it's a new development. For a long period of time, this this model of suppression of the woman was engaged in everyday life so deeply that no one was reflected on it. With Euromaidan, it was another important point for raising the feminist question and by engaging movement and changing the movement role in the civil society. Volunteer activism for sure brought a new hope and new important force for women to reconsider themselves as a part. But again, situation changed significantly if you move from urban center to the rural center. It's much deeper in terms of the stereotype division of the labor, in terms of household, in terms of trap of the poverty. Quite often you can see the culture of the poverty existing, and these many people, particularly during the conflict, moved to the border zone of Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. These poverty trap become very obvious in this particular area. We did not went on the ground. That's the only issue we have now. So unfortunately, when we were conducting our research on gender inequality and gender poverty in Ukraine, we rely on secondary sources. And recently, Ukrainian Canadian Canada's embassy in Ukraine, they emphasize new initiatives and new projects for Ukrainian NGO and international NGO. And again, this is a great opportunity for Ukrainian Canadians to empower the women engagement in all areas, including rural areas in Ukraine. Right now, they have a different accent. It's now proceeding through the process of decentralization, which is also important process. We didn't emphasize it in our research, but it is changing dynamics in terms of gender representation in Ukrainian rural areas in a positive way. It's very much work in progress, yet there's multiple issues in terms of integration of different groups and gender-specific initiatives and the decentralization. But at least when you open the plan for decentralization, there's a statement on the gender development engagement of the in rural part, in rural communities and hromadas in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for reflecting so thoughtfully on this complex issue. It makes me think of the recent interview-based research with Ukrainian immigrants to Canada that we ran together with Dr. Maureen Flaherty that showed that multiple female immigrants felt unsafe at their workplaces in Ukraine. They mentioned that they would not like to work as an assistant to a male, not appreciating the fact that young girls are raised to look towards a relationship with males as a source of improving their economic stance or well-being. So I'm curious if similar gender-based themes or patterns came up in your research work.
So that's important to understand your limitations, right? So when we've conducted focus groups, you know that you're not getting the full scale. You cannot apply it to the entire portrait of Ukrainian Canadian immigrants, female immigrants, but you've got this emotional connection. We have some response exactly echoing what you just said. When the woman was deprived from their perspectives and their particular career development, and that's why they choose in some way very sophisticated way to immigrate to Canada through the education, because it's one of the easiest way to migrate to Canada. Surprisingly, Ukraine is not even the first 10 among the immigrant sources for Canada right now, and been like this for a long period of time. Although there is a desire for Ukrainian community to help Ukrainians come to Canada and reduce a bit of economical burden, because financially it's not easy to come to Canada. Institutionally, you have to really go through a very specific and very competitive process of immigration to Canada. And we saw the similar patterns, but we also saw the patterns when the women were still applying their reproductive models. For example, why you migrate to Canada? Or because I want to have a safer future for my kids. She still postpone that, integration of your own perspective, of your own desires and goals in the process of migration. Quite often it's related to the different pattern of migration. There's a reunion of the family, which again, it's not an easy process. Based on our evidence, it's about 10 months, 10 to 2 years, between 10 months and 2 years. It's a normal process for unification. At least, we have combined sources. One is our group discussions, and second, we checked on official sites, and it's exactly that long it took people to reunite with their families.
Thank you so much for this insightful response. And speaking about reproductive rights, we know that informal employment or sometimes lack of registration or partial registration of employment relations, that are especially extremely common in the private field of economy in Ukraine, or often lead to lack of social protection, and in particular as far as maternity leaves are concerned, which of course disproportionately affect females. So do you have any policy recommendations that could help address and protect the female population better in Ukraine?
I wish I have a clear answer here, but I want to mention one more is specific, and actually another dramatic development on the gender in informal unemployment is age. We can see there is a significant, because of the poverty, it's all related to the poverty issue, in general related poverty. We saw the elder women engaged in, for example, street trade in the urban centers, or even small cities all over Ukraine, and it is affected. In some cases, it helps to overcome the problem of everyday life, but the same also increase the risk of the health disease, and it also reduce the security of the person. So age is another important component of the informal economy, and affected quite often badly aged women, so women from 45 and upper. And again, we've been talking about stereotypes and engagement in a formal source of employment and formal employment. We have these age stereotypes which prevent women to be active actors in a formal market, because they're just not considered to be compatible anymore. After particular, I was told after 45 years old, when you're 45. So, I mean, well, I'm laughing because I'm 45. I consider myself so like out of the market already in Ukraine. But what I'm saying, it is multiple dimensions, which unfortunately do not help to overcome the poverty, but let's say still demand women to perform and quite often move to the informal sector. I mentioned exotic bioeconomy model, right? And it was shocking to see how Ukrainian society reacted to this particular model of consider your body as asset, consider your body as a part of the, production, economic production. And important to understand that when we analyzed the women engaged in this market of international surrogacy, majority of them were from the small cities, from the eastern part of Ukraine, predominantly Russian-speaking. You cannot enlarge this picture because there were interview conducted, but there is very few statistics could be found on this particular sector. Again, this is informal sector. Very few of them actually engaged or have any kind of official employment with these surrogate centers in Ukraine. It's majority of the case. It's all covered. It's all covered and it's gone under the rug. So yeah, there's a multiple dimension of informal engagement, and again, the situation is worsening when you're going from the center to periphery.
Thank you, Milana. These are extremely important themes. Also the issue of ageism came up in our research with Dr. Flaherty as well, where several participants mentioned that they were really happy to see what they called to be absence of ageism in Canada as far as it was related to workplace, but also many of them were surprised by the ability of the older people to enjoy the simple pleasures of life, like sliding down the snow hills or acting young, which would stereotypically not always be viewed positively in Ukraine. So definitely some of those themes are very similar that are coming up in both of our ends. Thank you for also talking about the issue of international surrogacy. That's a very important indicator of Ukraine's economic well-being or lack of well-being thereof at the moment as well. So I wanted to remind everyone that you can continue submitting your questions into the Q&A chat box if you'd like. And yes, I could also ask Milana to comment more on how do the occupied territories and Crimea compare to the rest of Ukraine's territories in terms of informal economy. And if you could elaborate a bit more on this one, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I mean, we didn't conduct any, deep research on these areas. I wouldn't say my experience with Crimea, it's just my personal experience. I'm from that area, I still have family back there. Not sure I will be able to provide you with a sufficient response. I need to think about it. In terms of Donetsk and Luhansk, I mentioned significant migration out of the territories, migration from that occupied territories to Russia. It's definitely under research by Ukrainian researchers. Again, I relied on my estimation of how many people immigrate from the occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk to Russia, mainland Russia, based on Vladimir Mukamol, very kind of controversial approach how he counted numbers of people. There was some application, for example, for refugee status that was also cross-border counting. He applied, and he came with the idea that in 2014-16, about 1 million people migrated from this area, just to avoid to stay in the gray zone on so many levels. Gray zone including economy, engagement, and no control at all. So this part of Ukraine is suffering dramatically from the outflow of labor forces, significantly. So we know that the informal economy in occupied territories is dominated the sector, and they very much rely on Russian aid, which is regular aid in terms of performing this existing formal institutions, quasi-institutions. There are significant problem in the exchange of and in industrial centers, and suffering in terms of the local population and probably upcoming ecological and environmental issues with these territories. I wish we have a better understanding what's going on in these territories, but I know that even slight approach to understand or conduct interview in the occupied territory of Donetsk and Luhansk will be criticized by both sides. I don't know, do you know its name? Gwendolyn says she conducted through the different networks telephone interviews in occupied territories, and her findings was criticized by every single, both sides, Ukrainian researchers, people who are interested in Ukrainian research, and of course, Russian researchers. It's really hard to get a grip what's going on in there. We have multiple indicators that the situation quite there in terms of the migration out of this particular and poverty in general. But again, when you check in the websites of these occupied territories, you cannot obtain any reasonable or reliable information. So multiple sources, but not effective. There's not enough to tell exactly precisely how deep is crisis there.
Yes, thank you, Milan. We also know that Peter Pomerantsev conducted focus groups, in particular in the government-controlled areas, and came up to some quite interesting conclusions as far as the multiplicity of the identities of the people who reside in the in-between areas, the gray zones, and how they shift depending on their circumstances. And even within one conversation, you can hear people referring to themselves as being Ukrainian or identifying as Russia or with the temporary republics, like all kinds of thinking happening for people. So I guess I'll proceed with our last question for today. I know that Canada is among the top supporters of gender initiatives in Ukraine in general. So what else can be done to improve the general disparity, and what can we as the international community and as Ukrainian Canadian diaspora members do to help Ukraine in this regard?
That's where we're trying to find this kind of sweet spot with Ukrainian diaspora, by saying this strong positionality and access to the ears of Canadian politicians, and knowledge of the political system, economic system, cultural specifics in Canada, plus the knowledge of kind of specific of politics back in Ukraine and specific of the needs in Ukraine back there will be incredible asset for Ukrainian Canadians in their activities. We saw multiple initiatives, particularly reaching the climax 2014-15 in voluntary activities. There's unprecedented engagement, and I'm looking forward to see what Ukrainian Canadian Congress is going to publish. They recently conducted large research on Ukrainian Canadians. I believe you're also interested in this, right, Yuliia? So we definitely saw this spark of activities. Is it continue to be this large engagement? Usually it comes with a kind of, cooling down a little bit. And in our interviews in 2009, even in 2015, people were saying financially we're exhausted. It's hard for us to send money back because we need money to stabilize our life in here. Majority of Ukrainian Canadians look their future in Canada. They are not remitting much because they're investing in life in here. And again, the little percentage of the labor migrants, temporary labor migrants we can see in Canada from Ukraine, but they are very small. They're very much anchored back in Ukraine, and they consider their future back there. They remit more. They bring money back. So Ukrainian Canadians will put in a situation by incorporating different resources they have to help Ukraine, and they were sufficient, they were effective. You cannot run on this for long periods of time, but what is important in terms of now Canadian authority initiative of bringing this gender agenda to the Canada and to the world and support this initiative, that could be, I think, a cumulative interest. There is some dedicated funds for example, Ukrainian Canadian initiatives. I recently looked in one of the slides, I didn't mention it, but one of the slides indicate about $30 million for the gender-specific initiatives in Ukraine in the upcoming few years. The resource was shut down literally a few days ago. There was a large amount of money, and the Ukrainian Canadian definitely have to play an important part in, bringing cultural, social, intellectual capital back to Ukraine through and incorporating knowledge which we obtain by living in here back to Ukraine, to help to democratize society and overcome the poverty, not just, bringing resources, but bring knowledge. Again, when we're talking about rural communities in Ukraine, there is a lack of business culture in the people. Another interesting finding I didn't mention, about 2 million people recently migrate from Ukrainian rural areas to Ukrainian urban centers. It's a significant shift in terms of demographic population in Ukraine. Why the people leaving? Because the life conditions, because of the very few perspective in your personal development and safety and prosperity for your kids. So it should be addressed and might be changed. There are some interesting industrial projects right now introduced by Ukrainian authorities. You might have heard about this large construction of the roads, which helps definitely, which hopefully will help Ukraine to communicate rural part of Ukraine and urban centers better. So communication, infrastructure, large projects. Ukraine cannot overcome this burden by themselves, but also little initiatives as a business incubators for the women in rural areas, I think will be very, very effective. Or help with childcare, organization of the local childcare, or kind of interesting model of engagement women in a different kind of economic activities. This kind of partnership seems to me very productive.
Well, thank you so much, Milana, for this extremely insightful and engaging discussion. It was my great pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you to all of you for attending and for those who wrote your comments or questions. So I just wanted to remind everyone that we have 2 events coming up this month in the December. So we'll have a lecture on the implications of Nagorno-Karabakh war for the region, and we'll also have a reading club session discussing Borishilovgrad by Serhiy Zhadan. So stay tuned for further events and for further updates. And all the best to everyone. Thank you once again for attending today.